From Dr. W.J. Brendel, author of Cryptids and Monsters of North Carolina, comes a haunting new true history. Heretics of the Harvest Moon, the true story of the witch trials. A tale of fear, faith, and fire that shaped centuries of persecution. Available now on Amazon and at wjbrendel.com. Step into the darkness and see who survived the flames.
Welcome to Forever Paranormal, where shadows remember and silence has a way of speaking. I'm Dr. Bill, your guide through the strange and the unexplainable.
And I'm Deb. Every week we dig into what hides between belief and proof. Cryptids, hauntings, witchcraft, UFO sightings, and the stories people swear are true.
We don't tell you what to believe. We just look at what's possible, what's been witnessed, and what refuses to stay quiet.
If you like what we do, follow, rate, and share the show. It helps keep the lights on.
And if you want to go deeper, step inside the crypt. Patreon members get the show ad-free, a full day early, and gain access to our entire archives, years of investigations, bonus episodes, and conversations we don't release anywhere else. You can join at foreverparanormal.com or by searching Forever Paranormal The Crypt on Patreon.
And remember that you're never alone. If you ever need someone to talk to, the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline is 988.
Some stories don't begin with a house. They don't begin with a place at all. They begin with a person already worn down, already carrying something you can't quite see. And then something else finds them. Well, this is one of those cases. Welcome back to Forever Paranormal, where we know Natinak is more than a myth. And where the veil is thin, ghosts walk beside us, strange craft drift above us, and creatures move just out of sight. Every story is a door between worlds. And this week we step through, into a case where the haunting may not have lived in the house at all. Let's go ahead and welcome Deb into the show at this point. Welcome, Deb.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm okay. How about you?
I'm great. Spring is definitely sprung, and I hope you're enjoying it. Because I would have to say, you are, because I see sandals on your feet on a regular basis, so that's a pretty good sign for me.
Yep.
Yeah, so what do you have for us this week?
Sadly, Nick Pope passed away after a battle with cancer on April 6th. He was widely regarded as the world's most credible voice on UFOs and UAPs due to his 21-year career with the UK Ministry of Defence, where he ran the official UFO desk from 1991 to 1994. He transformed from a government insider into a leading media figure, famously labeled the real-life Fox Mulder, who declassified thousands of documents and appeared on hundreds of episodes of the History Channel's Ancient Aliens. His legacy lies in bridging classified government knowledge with public discourse, challenging institutions to be more transparent while proving that investigating strange aerial phenomena was a matter of national security rather than paranoia. Pope's approach to cases like the Rendlesham Forest incident and his advocacy for scientific openness continue to influence modern UAP research and policy discussions.
Well, Deb, thanks for giving us that. I know myself, I highly respected the way he always approached the subject. He was always professional and didn't come at it from a believer's standpoint, more of a skeptical believer standpoint because of all the evidence he saw over the years. All right, Deb, we're going to start in 1974 in Culver City, California. A woman named Doris Bither reached a point where whatever was happening around her could no longer be ignored. She was a single mother of 4, living in a home that by most accounts was barely holding together. The environment around her wasn't stable, it wasn't calm, it wasn't quiet, and really, neither was she. There are consistent reports that Doris struggled with alcohol, that her life had been shaped by violence, by instability, by things that just don't fade away when the day ends. That kind of weight does something to a person. It wears them down slowly. It changes how they move through the world. It changes how they react. And it leaves openings. And sometime before investigators ever arrived, Doris began telling people that something was in her house with her. Not a presence that watched, not something that lingered in the background, something that actually interacted. At first, it showed itself in ways people try to explain away, objects moving when they shouldn't, disembodied voices and sounds, a sense of something in the room that didn't belong there but refused to leave. But we also know it didn't stay small. The claims escalated. Doris reported being physically attacked, held down, touched inappropriately, and injured in ways that left marks. And those marks, according to later accounts, were not always easy to dismiss because there was bruises, there was physical evidence on the body that suggested something more than her imagination was at play here. Well, at least on the surface. I mean, she wasn't whispering about it. She wasn't hiding it. She wanted help.
Was she being taken seriously given her background?
Well, I have to say at first she probably wasn't being taken seriously in any kind of structured way at all, Deb. I mean, Doris didn't go straight to law enforcement or anything. There wasn't any kind of formal investigation or formal response, nothing like that. What she had was a situation that was getting worse, and she had no clear path to deal with it. I'm sure she didn't trust law enforcement. And that matters because cases like this usually don't begin with belief. They begin with someone pushing the story forward until it reaches the right ears. And that's what happened here. At some point, through a connection tied to a bookstore somewhere, her claims reached Barry Taff. Not through official channels, mind you, and not through anything institutional, just a chain of conversations that led from one person to another until it landed with someone willing to look at it. That's how Barry Taff became involved. Taff was working in parapsychology connected to UCLA's research circles. And he wasn't walking into this blind at all. He had an interest in these cases, a desire to document, to understand, and if we're being honest, I kind of think he had a little bit of a desire to validate that something real was happening in the field. To me, that's the flaw. Not a disqualifying one, but it does matter. But Taft didn't come alone, Deb. He came with fellow investigator Kerry Gaynor that brought a small team with him. He had cameras, equipment, people who were there to observe and document. And they didn't walk into a quiet home. They walked into a place where something was already in motion. According to the accounts, activity didn't need to be provoked. It didn't need to be built up over time. It was there. It was present and active, almost as if it didn't care who was watching. Lights were actually one of the first things they reported. Not reflections, not passing headlights, something forming inside the space. Luminous shapes, blue, purple, moving in ways that didn't match anything simple. Not staying still long enough to be easily captured on film, but not fleeting enough to ignore it either. Well, there are some photographs, and that's one of the reasons this case has lasted as long as it has. Images that show light anomalies that weren't easily explained at the time, but photographs don't settle anything on their own. We know that. They never do. They raise more questions. They give people something to point at. And they definitely don't give you certainty. The team also reported movement, objects shifting, things being displaced without a clear source. Not constant, not controlled, but present enough that it became part of the pattern rather than a one-time event. And through it all, Doris remained the center, not just as the witness, but as the focus.
So are you saying it wasn't the house that was haunted, it was her?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly where it all starts to shift at. Because in a typical haunting case, the location is what carries the weight. The history of the place, the land, whatever came before it, right? That's where people look first. But here, The activity didn't behave like it was anchored to the structure at all. It behaved like it was anchored to her, the person. When Doris was present, things happened. When she was the focus, the activity seemed to intensify. When she wasn't around, well, it eased. And when you start seeing that pattern, you're no longer dealing with any kind of traditional haunting. You're looking at something that follows a single person. At this stage, though, the investigation continued inside the home, night after night, observation after observation. And each time they returned, they weren't just looking for confirmation, they were actually kind of looking for some kind of escalation in it. Because whatever was there didn't stay at the level of flickering lights and movement, it pushed further. And Doris kept saying the same thing. It wasn't just there, it was interacting with her. By the time Barry Taff and Kerry Gaynor were both actively inside the house, the tone of the case had already shifted. This wasn't a slow build. It wasn't something that needed to be coaxed out. It had already been happening. And what they began documenting didn't stay in the category of unexplained light or movement for very long. The activity centered itself more clearly around Doris, not just in proximity, but in behavior. The reports begin to narrow in, focused, directed, not random. She described being grabbed, restrained, touched, and she was touched in ways that crossed from disturbing into something far more invasive. And while that part of the case has been exaggerated over time, yeah, we know it has, but it also stripped down to something more, almost cinematic. And it was not absent from the original claims. It was there. It just wasn't the whole story. What mattered more to the investigators was the pattern, the way the activity seemed to respond to her presence, to her emotional state, to the environment around her. There are accounts that suggest the intensity would rise when she was agitated and when the space itself felt a little more unstable because of that. And that's where the idea starts from. Not a house that's haunted, a person who is haunted.
Well, when they were in the room with her, did they see anything that made them believe this wasn't just her reacting to an internal problem?
Well, yeah, they did. At least that's what they put in the reports. I mean, I can't confirm it, but that's what's in the reports. There are moments in the case where multiple people claim to witness the same thing at the same time. So, yeah, light forming in the room, not reflecting from outside sources, but appearing within the space itself, and moving in ways that didn't match passing cars or streetlight bleed or anything like that. Something contained, something that had shape, even if it didn't hold it for very long. And those moments matter because they step outside of a single person account. Because if there were only Doris, only her voice, only her experience, the case would have ended pretty quickly, I would think. It would have been filed away as something internal, something psychological, something explainable through stress, trauma, and possibly alcohol, but that's not where it stayed. Because we also have reports of moving objects, not dramatically, not constantly, but enough to be noticed and be reported, enough to be remembered, enough to become part of the pattern the investigators were trying to understand. But we have to remember, still none of it happened under controlled conditions, right? There was no sealed environment, no repeatable setup, no way to isolate variables. And that's the problem that follows this case, in my opinion, all the way through it. Because everything that was seen in the moment, in the space, under conditions that were already pretty unstable. And yet, the people who were there didn't talk away from it. They didn't walk away from it. They just leaned into it and said, okay, what is this? We're seeing it. It's documented. And like I alluded to earlier, part of that comes back to Taff, his willingness to engage with the possibility that something real was taking place, but also his desire to validate it, to confirm that what he was studying wasn't just theory, it wasn't just speculation. That doesn't really make him unreliable, but it does mean that he wasn't being neutral.
How much of this can be attributed to, let's say, the power of suggestion?
Well, Deb, that's the right question. That's the question that never really leaves this case. When you walk into a case expecting nothing, you filter everything through doubt. You know that. And when you walk into something open to the idea that something is already happening, you filter things differently. You notice more, you interpret more. you allow more. Taff really wasn't trying to debunk this. He was trying to understand it. And in doing that, he may have crossed into wanting it to hold together as something genuine, but that still doesn't explain everything. Because even if you allow for bias, even if you allow for expectation, you still have multiple people describing similar things. You still have physical marks on doors that, well, at least in the moment, didn't have an immediate explanation that satisfied everyone involved. The more time they spent in that house, the clearer one thing became, though. Whatever was happening wasn't fading. It wasn't resolving. It was maintaining. It was holding steady. And in some moments, it felt like it was actually building. We have descriptions that suggest maybe more than one presence. Not just a single force, but multiple. One that seemed more dominant, more aggressive, and the others less defined, less central, but still there. The idea didn't come out of nowhere. It came from repeated experiences that didn't quite match each other, but they didn't contradict each other either. Slight differences, slight shifts, enough to suggest some kind of variation. And if that's true, if there was more than one, then this wasn't just an isolated anomaly. It was something being layered.
If this was attached to her, like you're suggesting, then what happens when she leaves the house?
Now that's what makes this case move out of familiar territory, Deb, because the assumption, the thing people rely on to make sense of hauntings, is that you can leave. You can change locations. You remove yourself from the environment, you reset the situation, but that only works if the location is the source. And here, that didn't seem to be the case. Because Doris did leave, more than once. And according to reports, whatever was interacting with her didn't stay behind. It followed her. Not in a way that made headlines, not in a way that was documented as heavily as the original investigation, but consistently enough that the pattern didn't break. The activity didn't end when she changed addresses. We know that. It stayed with her. And that's where the idea of attachment stops being theoretical. Because now, you're not asking what's in the house, you're asking what's connected to the person. And that's a much harder thing to walk away from.
When something follows like that, does it suggest it chose her or that something about her allowed it to stay?
I think it's both, in my opinion. Yeah, absolutely. It's something about her allowed it to stay, but something about her also allowed it to choose her. And that's where this case becomes less about what was seen and more about what was happening around her. We've got to remember, Doris wasn't living in a stable place in her life, right? That's consistent across all the accounts. There was stress, there was alcohol, there were reports of past violence. None of that proves anything on its own, but it does create an environment that isn't steady. It's not grounded. And when you start looking at cases that center on a person instead of a place, that kind of instability shows up more often than people are comfortable admitting. Not as a cause, but as a condition. Something that lowers the resistance, something that makes it harder to push back, harder to separate what's internal from what might be external. It doesn't create the phenomenon, but it may make it easier for something to take hold. That's the line you have to walk carefully, because it's easy to turn that into blame, and that's not what this is, in my opinion. What it does suggest is whatever was happening didn't need the house to exist, it just needed her.
But if that's the case, how do you separate that from something psychological, from trauma showing up in a way that feels external?
Well, you can't separate it cleanly. I think that's part of the problem. But we have to keep in mind, if this were strictly psychological, you would expect it to remain internal, to stay within her experience, her perception, her interpretation. But this case doesn't stay that way. It pulls other people in. Other people witness things. It creates moments where more than one person claims to see the same thing. And that really complicates it. At the same time, none of those moments were captured in a way that removes doubt. There's no clean documentation, just the written reports, things like that. No controlled observation that locks it into place as something undeniable. So you end up with two tracks running at the same time, Deb. You got one that says this is external, something acting on her. And you got one that says this is internal, shaped by everything she was already carrying, all the problems. And neither one fully cancels the other out. That's why this case stays where it is. Not resolved, not dismissed, just kind of sitting there unresolved because both explanations hold pieces that fit it.
Did it ever stop, or was this something that stayed with her all her life?
Well, from what's been reported, it never fully stopped until she passed away in 1995. It changed, it shifted. It wasn't always at the same intensity, and it didn't always present itself in the same way, but the sense of something being there didn't just disappear either. Even after moving out of California, even after putting distance between herself and the original location, she continued to report that the presence hadn't left. And that's where this case becomes difficult to close because there's no clear endpoint, right? No moment where everything goes quiet and stays that way. No final resolution where the activity is explained, removed, or proven to be something else. Instead, it fades into something less visible, but still present. Doris died years later, and even that part of the story kind of isn't very clear because dates vary depending on the source, right? But the cause is generally listed as cardiopulmonary failure. But the case itself doesn't resolve with her passing. It just stops being reported.
So when people call this one of the most documented cases, do you think that's really accurate?
No, I have to say no. But again, you got to look at what they mean by documented. Because there were investigators present, there were multiple witnesses, there were photographs taken that showed something unusual, there were handwritten reports, even if they don't prove what that something was. But it wasn't controlled, it wasn't repeatable, it wasn't documented in a way that removes interpretation. So it sits in that space where it has more material than most cases, but not enough to settle anything. And that's maybe why it stays in circulation so much, because it doesn't give you an answer. It gives you just enough to keep asking a question. Okay, Deb, you've asked some pretty good questions along the way here on this one, but I'm still going to ask you, what's your take on this case?
Obviously, we can rule out Doris's imagination given that there were witnesses, unless the witnesses were compelled to confirm these instances by some outside influence. I don't know.
Yeah.
That might explain why the documentation is lacking or sketchy. Regardless, I think weird sums it up in one word.
You know, I have to agree with you, but let's go ahead and close it out with this. Because what was actually happening to Doris Bither? Was it something external that found her and stayed? Was it something internal that reached a point where it no longer felt contained? Or was it something in between, where the line between those two things isn't as solid as people want it to be? I have to say that I question why they didn't look at her being possessed as a demon attachment or something like that, some kind of entity attachment. Maybe because he was a parapsychologist and just wanted to prove that ghosts were real. I don't know. And that's the part that sticks around, because this isn't tied to the house. It wasn't something that you could leave behind. Then the usual ways people do to protect themselves don't apply either. You can't just move. You can't just walk away. And if something can attach to a person instead of a place, then the question isn't just what happened to her. It's how often something like that happens without ever being recognized for what it might actually be. Not because it's proven, because it isn't, but because it never fully lets you settle on what it was. And once that question is there, at least in my mind, it doesn't leave cleanly. It stays just under the surface, waiting for you to decide what you think you're actually looking at. Well, at least until next time when we discuss another tale yet to be told. Thanks for listening to Forever Paranormal. Follow, rate, and share the show. It helps others find us and keeps the stories coming. Step inside the crypt for archive and exclusive episodes at foreverparanormal.com. And keep up with my latest books and research at wjbrendel.com. And until next time, remember, the veil is always thinner than you think.